Good evening. Now, this is a sensitive issue, and I wish to speak carefully. The matter I wish to address is that of childhood trauma and the effect of childhood trauma on the adult psyche. Now, I had the good fortune, to become quite aware of these matters as a younger man. I also had the sufficient funds at the time to undergo several different types of psychoanalysis, lasting several years. The latter one being Reichian analysis, conducted in accordance to somewhat with the postulates of Wilhelm Reich, the man who put people in pyramids to energize them and so forth, and had this idea of orgone, I think it's called, some kind of an ether. He was interested in childhood trauma. He was interested in trauma expressed in the body also. And I remember my therapist used to have me assume certain physical poses, which she could then work with. I did a family constellation, which again reaches back towards childhood to connect to trauma. And then, of course, I joined the cult, and Molyneux's cult was very much focused on childhood trauma as the driver of adult pathology. So I've been through a whole load of different experiences. Several I haven't even mentioned, but there are several more also. So it's not that I'm saying I'm an expert, but I do, I have looked into it. Let's put it that way. One of the first books that came to mind was the continuum concept, and this is a book that certainly awakened me to the idea of how childhood trauma occurs and how it forms. People don't understand it, you see, because the childhood trauma that in question usually occurs at 1 or 2 or 3 years of age. Usually at 1 year of age, actually. And I don't think you can remember those things, especially when there's a traumatic event. And the trauma is to the abandonment by modern families, modern mothers, modern society, the abandonment of in-arms child rearing. So babies are put down away from their mother in a cot or something separately. And this is a highly traumatic event, because a child of that age is literally dependent on his environment for his life, and his environment consists of his mother, certainly for, I think, I don't know whether to say a year, I don't know the details of it, but certainly the first year. I see, many so-called primitive peoples or less sophisticated peoples will carry their children, the women will carry the children at the breast for about a year. When I met with the Romani people over in Italy, we got to know them quite well. My wife was involved with them, and it was really interesting to see what they were up to. They were quite a bunch, but their women all had that. They didn't put the child down. The child got down when the child was ready to get down, and the children were notably different to Western children. They were very confident. They were very sure of themselves. Now, they were quite mature for their age as well, because they hadn't been traumatized. But all of our children are traumatized, first of all, by being left away from the mother's arms far too early, when they're not ready for it, and then being forced into all sorts of, socializing events and not to mention medical procedures and all this stuff. This is trauma. It's serious trauma. You see, as a child, you have no real recourse for it. So these traumatic events tend to get cut off. We can't remember our desperation as we cried and cried and cried alone at night with nobody to come and comfort us because the control mechanism had been adopted and making us cry through the night or whatever. Or even the harsh words, that are delivered to us sometimes unjustly. We're children, we're very small children. Because we depend on our environment, you see, for our very survival. And small children create the environment with their mind. They believe that the environment around them is their responsibility, and they try to control it with their mind. I think we all do it to some extent, but that's kind of like a very animistic, basic level of consciousness. You need the environment around you to be just so you kind of you take responsibility for it. So anything that goes wrong in the environment, again, the child feels personally responsible. They've done it, they've broken it, what have they done? And that creates stress and anxiety, great stress and anxiety. It can be appeased, of course, with a loving parent, with contact and soothing words. This is how it's done, but it can't be appeased simply by reasoning or by leaving the child alone to meditate on things if you think they're being naughty. So that's the basic trauma. Then you've got school and so on and so on. The early ones are the deepest ones, generally speaking. And we adopt various psychological mechanisms to deal with these traumas. And the psychological mechanisms, or kind of pathologies, I suppose you would call them, that we adopt regularly and function in society with them, are things like narcissism, of course, which is quite widespread. Borderline personality disorder is another one, which is very common, very common. I can speak about that, but I'm sure you know what it is, or you can find out. Multiple personality disorder, manic depression, the mental problems that we have to deal with. Somebody with an overbearing personality, great arrogance, great anger, or excessive timidity, and anxiety is a very common ailment in our society. Great anxiety. People need to take pills in order to deal with the harsh reality of the world. All these mental conditions, you see, really, and ultimately the very personality of people, our personality is what we call a personality. I think person is some kind of a mouthpiece. I was reading about it recently, of a face mask. So it's a theatrical idea. Our personality is again, it's a cloak. It's a way that we hide behind a personality to some extent. Most things, that we call personality, they're not very interesting, actually. I don't know how recent the idea of personality is. I don't think it's as engraved in stone as people might think. It's a very common idea these days. I'm sure there are aspects, but it seems that trauma plays a very great role, you see, in our adult lives. And of course, it also then, it mediates our interpretation of the world around us, because we look at it through the eyes of trauma, unaddressed trauma. Now, I would say that almost all people suffer from unexpressed childhood trauma. And I say almost all. Of course, somebody may have been brought up in an in-arms type of culture with a different approach to children, in which case they probably avoided that. Or they might have had in-arms parents, for example, very enlightened, and they might have been able to avoid, certainly, the most heinous aspects of it. Others will have had, will have been victims of sexual abuse, as I believe I was, and many people of my generation were. And these create, again, very deep split-off traumas that affect the personality. So, because I did Reichian therapy and I did a family constellation and I studied with Molyneux and all these various bits and pieces, I've learned how you can deal. I studied with Daniel Mackler as well. I've learned different ways of techniques that you can use to recover from childhood trauma as an adult, and I think they're very interesting. And I think they're very advantageous for everybody to try to do them. And basically, it's just about reaching out to yourself as a child with love and sympathy and empathy. So, first of all, you need to listen to yourself as a child, and you need to kind of cast your mind back and travel back. And it can be done through, particularly photographs can be very helpful. Only photographs of yourself as a child. You need to kind of look at the facial expression and try to remember what was happening. And speaking to relatives can also be very helpful, of course, because relatives will, recall aspects of yourself. Certain incidents maybe that you've remembered, you can relate them, you can play them back to somebody who knew you, and maybe they'll give you a slightly different version of that incident. So there are those exercises, and then there are some massage exercises that you can do. It's kind of like Reich had people. He would always have people standing with their knees bent, that kind of loose-kneed, toes pointing inwards slightly, arms hanging, and just keeping slack but standing. And then in that position, my therapist would ask me to speak my thoughts to particular individuals. You can speak. The therapist can say, who do you see before you, and whoever it might be, you're looking at your family, so somebody else in your family or yourself. And then you speak your thoughts, you speak what you have on your mind to that person as though they were there. And the effects of doing this, once you get into it, are very powerful. They're very powerful because quite soon, if you connect, of course, the tears will start to flow. And that's what we need. We just need to cry a little bit for our child, for our wounded and injured child, rather than trying to shut it out through all sorts of strategies. Those things happened. They were terrible. They shouldn't have happened. It's not that our parents were evil. They were misinformed in the main. But at the same time, it's very important not to justify them, because as an entirely helpless child, your experience was still devastating. To know whether it was misinformation or malice was of no help whatsoever. It was happening to you. So those people are by definition abusers. They were your abusers as a child. I don't want to give it, all the kind of modern ideas of that word, but still, in your respect, that's who they are, that's who they've been. When I discovered this, when I started to really look into this, I went through it quite hardcore because I was with Molyneux at the time, and I separated from my family over this issue, which he used to call defooing. He advised everybody to defoo. I mean, the man was, I have very many criticisms of his method, but, sometimes you learn from in unlikely places. So this was, I did this for 2 years, and I had no contact with my mother and father in particular, or with my older sister, who then unfortunately died before I had a chance to reconnect. It was pretty hardcore. But I did connect to an anger, and I tried to speak about it to my parents, and I discovered, in fact, that they were very callous still in respect of my childhood. Very callous. And when I tried to voice any concern, they immediately started to justify themselves, as parents will do. because they go on to the defensive. It was interesting to look at it, and it was interesting to have that period of disconnection. I'm not saying that people should do it. I think it's quite cruel. I think I was quite cruel to my mother and father. They were quite elderly at the time, indeed. These things used to happen for younger people. This is how I first heard about the cult associated with Molyneux, because a young fellow had separated from his mother, and she'd lost him, and she found out he was in the cult, and she was a counsellor, so she went to the newspapers, and the story got out, and that's how I came across Molyneux. So, that shows how clever I am. You find a story about somebody who's abandoned and all that. But then I started reading what he was writing, and I started listening to him, and I was just instantly interested in his description of philosophy and the arguments that he was making. I was absolutely drawn to them. It took me a lot longer to see the weaknesses. But I think on the matter of childhood trauma, he was pretty good, but rather extreme, of course, because there are other forces in the world. But I do think childhood trauma is primal, and I think it would be very beneficial for everybody to address it in their own life and to see what happens. It's not even particularly difficult to do. I wonder whether I can offer my services as a childhood trauma therapist to anybody. I think I've got the experience to do it. I think it's probably cheeky. I would have to have some kind of rubber stamp maybe, but I'm happy to help anybody to reconnect, because I know how I did it, and I know kind of how it's done, and family constellation as well, which is another useful technique. So I've spoken about that many years ago. And it can have remarkable effects, of course, in the present. You might find that you're not who you think you are at all. These things happen.